Hello, Year 12, and welcome to our third lesson in the Philosophy of Religion unit. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at mind, body, and soul. So the things you need to know are Plato's idea of the immortal soul, Aristotle's idea of a functional soul, Descartes and substance dualism, and Gilbert Ryle and materialism. Okay, so we'll start by exploring this idea. So this is a unit which is all about personal identity. You, what exactly are you? What are we? What is consciousness? Where is it located? Is it just a phenomena created by the brain? Are we just the same thing as the brain? Or is there something more? Are we some sort of immortal, immaterial soul? So let's start with some definitions. So first of all, mind. This is the element of a person that enables them to be aware of the world and their experiences, to think and to feel. Faculty of consciousness and thought. So we all have a mind. It's what enables us to think and to experience. Body. This is a physical structure, including the bones, flesh, and organs of a person or an animal. This is a physical thing in the universe. It's made of atoms, and it can be touched. And then we have soul. This is the spiritual or immaterial part of a human being. It's not reducible to the physical world, and it is immortal. It somehow survives death. And this is the most controversial idea. Many philosophers don't believe that there is such a thing as a soul. So if we have mind, body, and soul, most philosophers think that our identity, what makes us who we are, is just the brain. We are the brain. Your memories, your emotions, your thoughts, your feelings, your likes, your dislikes, your awareness. This is simply the physical, material workings of the brain. And if you think this, then you're a materialist. Materialists don't believe in the soul. They believe that the only thing that exists is matter, and we are matter. And this means that we die. Not just our bodies, but our consciousness dies at death. When the brain dies, we die. However, many have said that we are more than just the body. We're more than just the brain. And if this is the case, then we also have a soul that's separate from our body. Okay? So is the mind a physical manifestation of the body, just electrons or electricity firing in the brain between nerve endings? Or is the mind something more? Is it some sort of immortal, immaterial soul? So that's the question. Now, where do you think you exist then? You and your identity, is it in the brain, or are you something more than this? So, this is what we mean by the term soul. It's intangible. It's something that you can't see or touch. It's immortal, that lives on after death. It's unchanging and unique. It's not visible. And if you're a Christian, it comes from God. It's eternal, and it's a true version of ourselves. And obviously Christians believe in this idea of the soul, or most Christians do. And this is because we have a physical body. Our souls survive death. And we therefore have an identity that can be judged in the next life. I say most Christians, not all Christians believe this. Okay, so do we have a soul? Well, this is a really tricky question. As I've said, most philosophers would say, no, we don't. There's no evidence really for a soul. There is only this idea that there must be something more to us than electricity firing between nerve endings in the brain. There have been some experiments, proper scientific experiments, which have tried to demonstrate that there could be a soul, and we'll look at those a little later. So this is the idea of substance dualism, and this is put forward by both Plato and René Descartes. And we're going to be looking at both of these philosophers in this week's lesson. Okay, substance just means an entity, a thing, a substance. And dualism means two. So there are two substances. There is body and there is mind or soul. The opposite of substance dualism is materialism. Materialism is the view that there is only material. You are your brain. There's nothing extra or on top of this. So what are human beings made of? Well, anatomists, people who study the body, will say that we're made of, carbon and water. Materialists would say that this is all that we are. Our consciousness is just a phenomenon that comes out of a physical structure. And the issue with this is that there does seem to be something more to us, doesn't there? What explains love and intention and desire and dreaming and thoughts? Can this all just be electricity firing in the brain? So can our mental processes be explained through biological processes? Are we just a physical body? Will we survive death? Is the soul attached to the body? Is the soul something separate? Or maybe the soul doesn't even exist. So the first philosopher we're going to look at is Plato. So you might want to pause the video and think to yourself, what do we already know that Plato believes about the soul? Okay, so Plato is very much a dualist. He believes that the soul and the body are separate. So we all possess an immortal soul that was once present in the realm of the forms, and the soul is our true or real nature. The body is just this impermanent physical thing that our soul has been trapped within. So for Plato, there are two realms of existence. The visible material shadow world of the cave that we live in every day, and this is available to our senses, and this is the world that the body is aware of. And then there is the invisible, absolute, perfect world that is available to us only through rational thought and contemplation, and this is associated with the immortal soul. So Plato says that the body and the soul are separate. They are separate substances. The body is physical, it's temporary, it's changing. The soul is the essence of a person, it's eternal. So this means the soul is immortal. The body dies, but the soul doesn't. Not only does the soul survive death, but it's existed before death as well. This is the idea of transubstantiation of the soul, or reincarnation. So the soul has always existed and always will. In normal life, the soul is inside a material body. And being inside a body makes the soul forget knowledge that the soul had access to in the realm of the forms. And this knowledge is knowledge of the forms. We know this from Plato already. So beauty, reality, goodness, truth. This is why we can recognize shadowy reflections of these ideas in the material world, because our souls are immortal and already have knowledge and recollection of these ideas or Platonic forms. So we know this already. Plato uses the argument from the Meno to show that even a slave boy has an immortal soul, able to recollect previous knowledge from the realm of the forms. So he asks a slave who has no formal education in maths to work out twice the area of a square by drawing a square in the ground. And he's able to do this. He's never been taught it, but that's because his soul is familiar with the ideas from a previous existence. Therefore, humans have an immortal soul. So the soul has knowledge of the forms. Now this is great news for Socrates. So in Plato's dialogue, The Apology, Socrates, his mentor, his teacher, is put to death. And Socrates goes to his death gladly, willingly, and without any fear. Why do you think Socrates has no fear of death? Just pause the video and think about that to yourself. Well, the idea is that death isn't the end. It's only the end of this illusory or material existence on Earth. Some arguments that Plato gives for this, the idea of contrasts or duality in the world. So we can ask ourselves, why does someone feel hot? And the idea is you feel hot because you once felt cold. You can only understand what it means to be too hot if you have once been too cold. This might be a little difficult to understand, but I think what Plato's getting at here is that we only understand something in contrast with its opposite. Similarly, why is a light too bright? Well, because sometimes it's not too bright. So every characteristic, the argument says, comes from the existence of its opposite. So again, you might want to pause the video and think to yourself, how is this going to prove the existence of a immaterial soul? So, there is death because there is life. There is life because there is death. So this is quite a Indian idea, actually, a Hindu or Buddhist idea, similar to reincarnation. So this is the idea that there is a material body, and so its opposite must exist, which is an immaterial soul. The soul is immortal, it's perfect, it's our true identity. It's independent of the body. It's the complete opposite and contrast to the body. It's trapped and confused by being in an imperfect body in an imperfect world. It's reincarnated between lives, but forgets previous lives. The soul animates the person. It gives the body life and movement. So we could say this woman is on a diet. Maybe she's thinking, I've had a really rubbish day, I feel sad, and I'm really hungry, and she's craving Nando's and ice cream. What is she likely to do? Well, she may go and eat the food that she so desires. So Plato goes a little further and says that the soul in the body is often led away from reason. It's often controlled by emotion and appetite and led astray. So our immortal souls have these different competing forces. So appetite, emotion, and reason. And reason is the soul's true nature. Appetite and emotion come into being as we enter a body that has desires in the material world, like Nando's and ice cream. So Plato uses an analogy, and he uses this in one of his dialogues. This is called the Phaedrus. And the analogy says that the soul is a little like a charioteer. A charioteer is somebody who is riding a chariot being pulled by two horses. So the soul can be defined as having three elements. The horses, one of them is the appetites, things that we want, and the other one is emotion. And they kind of drive the soul. And that's okay. However, the charioteer is reason, and the charioteer should be controlling the appetite and controlling the emotion. If the appetite and the emotion control the charioteer, then the chariot's just going to be running all over the place. So all Plato is saying is that the soul's essential nature is reason, and it should be controlling and limiting the appetite and the emotion. So this is called Plato's tripartite approach to the soul. Tripartite means just three parts. So if the soul and the body are two distinct things, one is material, that's the body, and one is immaterial, that's the soul, how do they interact? How does something physical cause or interact or be affected by something non-physical? And that's a really difficult question. How do we make sense of that? How does the soul move the body? We don't really know. This is what Plato says. There's no real solution to this. He does, however, give an example of something which may help us understand this. This is called the myth of And this is a myth that he invents. So is a soldier who dies in battle. And 10 days later, his body is found to have not decomposed at all. It's not rotted. This is just a myth that Plato's invented. So don't worry too much about it. It's just a way of explaining his dualism. So on the 12th day, he comes back to life and tells people that they will be judged after death based on whether or not they have performed good deeds. And the rewarded souls will then choose another life on earth, either as a human or animal. So Plato's idea here is that there are two realms of our existence. Physical, which isn't really the real world, the world of the cave, and the immaterial, the soul, which is our true life and our true identity, but it gets reincarnated consistently into new bodies. Okay, so Plato is a dualist, a substance dualist, and we can see how this has influenced Christianity. It's very similar to many Christians who believe that the soul is our true identity and it survives death and is judged. Now, Aristotle, complete opposite. So you might want to pause the video and say, what do you think Aristotle is going to say about the soul? Do you think he will agree with Plato or not? So Aristotle is going to state that all that exists is the material world. Aristotle disagrees with Plato's division of the world into the visible material and the invisible non-material. So there is only one world, and therefore there is only the physical body that makes you. So can we say that this is the same person? So this is a thought experiment now. Now, yes, it is the same person, but also no, it's sort of not the same person. So constantly changing and growing and developing. So Aristotle says that there is some sort of continuing identity or essence that is the same person, even though the physical person is constantly changing. So this is called the psyche or the mind. Okay, and it is still the same object, just like an acorn is the same acorn when it becomes an oak tree. So Aristotle and the soul. The soul is simply and nothing more than the body, but it's the form that the body takes. The soul is the form or the formal cause, and the body is the matter or material cause. So remember Aristotle's idea of the four causes. Material, the formal, the efficient, and the final. The soul is the formal, the structure behind the material body. So the form or the structure of something isn't something separate from it, it's just its design or layout. So the soul or psyche is simply what animates or gives movement or life to the physical body. But there isn't something separate. Okay? The psyche is just the way that the material works. So there are different kinds of souls. We've got to be careful about what Aristotle means by soul. He does not mean some ghost-like, immaterial, separate substance. He just means the form or way in which something is ordered or develops. So probably soul's the wrong word to use. It's probably better to use form. So there are different types of forms. So there's sort of the plant form, animal form, and human form. Now you could say, therefore, that's the plant's soul, the animal's soul, and the human soul, but that probably confuses a modern audience. So we have a plant's soul, and this is a nutritive soul. It gives nourishment for itself to ensure the reproduction of the species. So this is the principle behind a plant that guides its matter into growing, and that's through nutrition. And then there's the perceptive soul, and this sort of guides animals' matter into fulfilling its telos, or its formal cause, or final cause, sorry. So the perceptive soul senses, view the world around them, experience pain and pleasure. And finally, rational soul. Now this is a little confusing because actually in humans we have all three of these souls. Because we have a nutritive soul as we grow and develop, digest food, etc. A perceptive soul as we see the world, but also we have a function or a formal soul, which is our ability to use reason. That gets confusing. That doesn't mean we have three souls. Again, it's probably best not to use the word soul. It's probably better to use the word like form or function. So Aristotle says all that we understand by the soul really is just the capacity any body has to do whatever it's meant to do. Okay, so this is the final cause, or the telos, as well. So what is the telos or final cause of a plant? To grow or to reproduce. Therefore, it has a soul, which is a nutritive soul. The soul is simply what allows something to complete its purpose. So this is true of all objects in the world. All objects have a soul. It just means their purpose. So the soul of a axe is its capacity to chop, for example. Does this axe have its soul anymore? Well, no, it doesn't. That doesn't mean there's some sort of ghostly axe substance which is floated out of the axe. The soul is nothing more than the ability for the axe to be able to chop. So if it can no longer chop because it's broken, it's lost its soul. And it's the same in the human body. Not only do humans have a soul, a purpose, but so do the separate parts of the human body. So what's the soul or purpose of an eye? Well, it's to see. If you go blind, your eye has lost its soul. That doesn't mean something immaterial and ghostly has vanished out of the eye. It just means the eye has lost its ability to function correctly and to fulfill its telos. Okay, so the soul of a human is to flourish or achieve eudaimonia. This human has died. They've lost their soul. He wasn't saying that we've lost something which floats out above us. We just lost our ability to do something. So objects don't have this idea of a soul in Plato's sense. Instead, they just have something which is sort of like a vital energy within the matter that allows it to fulfill its function. And he gives the example of this with a wax stamp. This might help explain Aristotle's idea of the soul a little bit more. So in a wax stamp, you have the wax, and then you have the stamp that goes into the liquid wax, and then it dries into that shape or that form. Can you separate the wax from the stamp? The stamp is the shape, the pattern. The wax is the material. And the answer is no, you can't separate the wax from the stamp. They are one and the same thing. You can't separate the ability to chop from the axe. They are one and the same thing. You can't separate the ability to see from the eye. And therefore, you can't separate the soul from the body. They're not separate things. They're just the body's ability to fulfill its function. Therefore, Aristotle really is a materialist. He doesn't believe that you survive death. The soul is just the word that we give for something to being able to fulfill its telos or its function. And once that's gone because you've physically died, then the soul has died as well. Okay? So, recap. Metaphysical questions are those which question whether things exist and the nature of things that exist. Plato believes in two realms, the material and the metaphysical. The material world is associated with the body, which is constantly changing and is a shadow of the eternal realm. The soul is associated with the eternal realm of the forms. Plato believes that we all possess an immortal soul which once existed in the realm of the forms. This is the reason we have knowledge of the forms. However, the soul forgets the knowledge of the realm of the forms when it enters the physical body, and it becomes confused. Plato uses the example of Meno's slave to illustrate his point. Plato believes that every characteristic exists because of its opposite. For example, something is only dark because light exists. Therefore, life exists because of death, and vice versa. Because the soul gives life, it must be immortal. Okay? Let's look at some strengths and weaknesses then of Plato's substance dualism. So one strength, it's very much in line with thinking concerning religious belief, the idea of a immortal soul being judged in the afterlife. But then we might say, just because religious people might agree, this doesn't mean it's true. We could say, well, it makes sense of how we can have intuitive understanding of things like beauty and justice. Criticism was, how does something non-physical interact and move something physical? How does something physical affect something non-physical? So Plato, the soul is the essence of a person. It's immaterial, gives a thing life, consists of reason, appetite, and emotion. The body and the soul are separate. The body is material, subject to change. The soul is immortal, whereas the body is clearly not. So they must be able to be separate upon death. Links to the theory of immortal souls once inhabiting the realm of the forms. So it links to his wider philosophy, the idea of the cave, for example. And for Plato, there can be a life after death because we are our souls and it survives our body. So Plato believes that the soul is comprised of appetite, emotion, and reason, and uses the metaphor of the chariot to teach us that we must use reason to control our appetite and emotions. Now, Aristotle refers to the soul as the psyche and believes that it is the continuing essence of a person. People have a different type of soul depending on their telos or purpose. For example, a plant has a nutritive soul because it needs to take on nutrients in order to reproduce, whereas animals have a perceptive soul in order to experience the world around them and feel pain and pleasure. According to Aristotle, the soul is the capacity to do whatever a thing is meant to do. For example, the soul in an axe would be its capacity to chop. The soul cannot be separated from the body because it is not possible to separate a thing's capacity to do something from the thing itself. So for Aristotle, it's just the continuing identity of a person, the psyche, includes the structure and function of the body, provides living things with their capabilities. Now, they're not technically separate, but the soul and the body are separate terms because the soul is the body when it's working correctly. So a thing's capability cannot exist independently of the thing. So this links to the idea of the four causes. The soul gives the matter its form, efficiency, and final purpose. And can there be life after death? Well, no. The soul and the body are inseparable. A thing dies because it has lost its capabilities, which in turn means it's lost its soul. So strengths and weaknesses of Aristotle's understanding of the soul. First of all, this is what Aristotle says. It's a little more complex than Plato, so we'll just lay it out. The soul is simply the body fulfilling its purpose. It's not a different substance, though. There is no separate immaterial soul, unlike in Plato's conception, and you do not survive death. So yes, it does make sense. We often talk about how a football team, has lost its soul. So if we say, Real Madrid has lost its soul, no one believes there's a separate soul for a football team. We're just saying that the football team has lost its ability to do what it's supposed to do to succeed at football. Therefore, why should this be any different for humans when we speak about the soul? Surely the only thing that has been lost when someone dies is their ability to perform their function, the brain's ability to work the body. You might say, no, it doesn't make sense because some people could arguably be alive and have lost their soul. So somebody, let's say, who is disabled or maybe in a condition, a vegetative state where they're no longer able to move or no longer able to think or have consciousness, are they dead? Well, according to Aristotle, well, maybe. Is that an issue? Does it make sense? Yes, the ability for an object to do something and the physical matter of the object itself are no different. Look at the axe example. Is there evidence for it? Well, there's no evidence for Plato's view. We've never seen a soul. This is much more in line with modern thinking, and indeed, modern biologists such as Richard Dawkins actually agree with Aristotle's idea of the soul. Okay, so dualism is the idea that has been introduced through Plato so far. This is the belief that there exist two distinct categories of things, and that is the body and the soul, and Plato believes in this. However, he's not the only philosopher to believe in this. We have other philosophers, including René Descartes, who we're going to look at in a second. This is the idea for substance dualists, that the body has the role of movement and digestion, etc. And the soul is thinking and personality. So there are separate properties that each of these have. So the body has properties such as being tall or young or hairy, and these are properties of extension. They exist in the physical world. They take up space and they have measurements. So I can describe your body. The soul kind of doesn't have that same element of physical description. It doesn't take up space, and it's not physical. So it has properties of thought. And this is the idea that thought and extension are two very different things. So should we therefore consider the soul and the body as two separate things? So, what do you think of the dualist view of the body and the soul? You might say you're not convinced, because instead of saying the mind has properties of thought and the brain has properties of extension, perhaps we just have the brain has properties of thoughts. Maybe we are just the physical brain and we can still have properties of thoughts. We might say we are convinced. The problem is that the brain is physical. So how can it have non-physical properties? Thought seems to be a non-physical thing. How can a physical thing, the brain, have a non-physical thing, thoughts? We might be unconvinced. How can something physical interact with something non-physical? So how does the soul move my body? When I decide to move my hand, how does something non-physical move something physical? And similarly, when I feel pain, that's from my body, but I seem to feel it in my soul. My soul is my mind. So how does something physical cause pain in something non-physical? So a more modern substance dualist, obviously we have Plato, but a more modern substance dualist would be René Descartes. Now, René Descartes was very famous for the cogito ergo sum, where he says, I think, therefore I am. We don't really need to know this, but we could explore it very quickly. So René Descartes was a French philosopher, scientist, and mathematician who lived between 1596 and 1650. He's often called the father of modern philosophy. In his book, Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes identifies human identity with the mind and human thoughts and not the body. So what we are in essence is a thinking thing. He famously states, I think, therefore I am. So in the Meditations, he's really just questioning the nature of knowledge. What can we know? So you might want to pause the video and think to yourself, can you think of a time when you thought one thing to be the case, but actually you were wrong? Okay, and these are illusions. They happen all the time. We can doubt our knowledge. So you might think, that I had this experience of flying, and then you realize it was a dream. Dreams are great examples of illusions. They're not really real. Now, in your dream, it felt like you were flying. You could see the ground underneath you. But this was an illusion. So this suggests that our senses can't be trusted. Our senses don't always tell us the truth. So Descartes says, well, my senses can't ever be trusted to give me true and certain knowledge. This is called hyperbolic doubt. I doubt anything that I think I know, especially that which comes from the senses. Now, you can't prove beyond all doubt that you have a body. You can't do that, I'm sorry. Because you could be in a big, elaborate dream. You could be dreaming. Your whole life could be a dream where you're dreaming you have a body. Or you could be in some Matrix-style alternate reality. You could be in virtual reality. Descartes says you could be tricked by an evil demon to think that you have a body. Now, can you prove that you have a mind, though? And this is where Descartes disagrees. I can doubt I have a body, but I cannot doubt I have a mind. Therefore, the body and the mind are distinct and separate. So let's go through this. Descartes says he can't doubt he has a mind, because as soon as he doubts if he has a mind or not, he's proven that he has a mind. Because you have to have a mind in order to doubt that you have a mind. This is what he means by I think, therefore I am. As soon as I think anything, I've proven that I exist. So I can't doubt I have a mind. That is clear and distinct knowledge which is available to me at all points. I can doubt that I have a body, though, because I could be dreaming. If I cannot doubt the mind, but I can doubt the body, they must be distinct and separate things. You might disagree with this. This is his argument for substance dualism. You might say this is rubbish. But this is Descartes' argument. So this is the idea that the mind and the body are fundamentally different substances. Human identity is to be found with the conscious thoughts of the mind. So the mind and the body still interact, though. It's a little bit like someone who's driving a car and the car. The soul, or the mind, manipulates the body, but it's not the same thing as the body. Now, materialists, we're going to look at that later, would disagree with Descartes. They'd say the experience of being a human isn't as two separate things. It isn't like we're driving our bodies, is it? We have this sense that we are our bodies. So Descartes says the mind and body are separate. You can be sure of the mind, but not the body. And the mind has principles of thought and properties of thought, and the body has properties of extension. So this is the cogito ergo sum, which in Latin means I think, therefore I am. So the body has properties of extension, the mind has properties of thought. And Descartes was operating out of a period of human thought called the Enlightenment, and this is the scientific revolution. So this is where things were being questioned constantly, received knowledge was being questioned constantly, and Descartes is attempting to form the first foundations from which a science could develop. So his next question is, well, in the world that we perceive and interact in scientifically, it seems that things are moving. And they're moving by, if we look at Isaac Newton, according to physical laws. So a physical object moves another physical object. So how does a non-physical object move a physical object? This is a really big problem. And Descartes says it's through the pineal gland. Okay, and the pineal gland was this section of the brain that they discovered at this point, and it was sort of full of, we still have it obviously, it's full of kind of air, and they didn't really understand what it did. There was no real explanation. So Descartes latches onto this idea and says, well, this must be where the soul enters the body. It's in the pineal gland. And that's how the soul moves the body. Now, this still doesn't really explain it, because then we could say, how does the soul move the pineal gland? Because the pineal gland is a material object. So this is his sailor analogy. Descartes asks, is the relationship between our mind and our body a bit like a sailor steering a ship? Or a driver driving a car? Two very separate things. Well, he says we're in control, but we're not distant. We don't feel separate from the ship. We may be a separate thing from our body, but we're much more intimately involved in our bodies and feel much more a part of the experiences and physical sensations. And this is because we enter the body through the pineal gland. And one big problem with this is modern science has discovered that the pineal gland is actually where hormones are released. So Descartes has been proven incorrect, at the very least, in where the soul enters the body. Now, that doesn't disprove Descartes, because you could just say, well, it's another part of the brain where it enters. but it's definitely not the pineal gland. Okay, so strengths and weaknesses of Descartes' substance dualism. So strengths, mind does seem to be different with different properties. Weaknesses, there's no compelling evidence as to how the body and the mind link. Pineal gland was proven wrong. Strengths, it means there could be life after death. Provides explanation and comfort. It's logically strong. Everyone can grasp this idea that we feel different to our bodies. It's attractive because our mind and bodies do feel separate. We can lose parts of our bodies and still be us. How is that possible? I can lose my hand and still be me. And Descartes would say that's because you're not really your body, you're your soul, you're something beyond. Weaknesses, well, we can lose parts of our brain and we lose who we are. Well, Descartes would just say that's because we've lost the part of the brain that enables that part of the soul to express who we are. We haven't actually lost a part of who we are. Descartes asserts his idea that the mind and body are different substances without giving any real reason to believe him. How can we explain physical interactions? So this is substance dualism. And some philosophers have said this goes too far. It's not two different substances, and they've decided that maybe it's better to view our mind-body relationship as property dualism. This is the idea that we are our brains, so it's sort of a form of materialism, but that our brains have a physical property that we can touch, that we can see, that's made of atoms, and a mental property, our consciousness, and they're two separate things, but they're not two different substances, they're just two separate properties. Okay? So now let's look at materialism. Materialism is possibly the most popular view in the modern scientific age. And materialism, very simple, just means matter. Materialism states that you are your brain. There is no soul. The experience of the organ of the brain is your consciousness. But you are your brain. That is you. So materialism is the belief that there exists only material or physical substances. It's the opposite of dualism. So we have Gilbert Ryle, and we also have Thomas Hobbes as our main proponents of these ideas. Gilbert Ryle attacks substance dualism. And the way that Ryle does this is by saying that the substance dualist, like Plato or Descartes, seems to be inventing a ghost in the machine. The idea here is that the body is like a complex machine. And if you don't understand how the complex machine works, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to invent some sort of ghost that controls it. It's a bit like somebody coming across a laptop who's never seen one before, and they can't explain physically how the laptop works. So how do they explain it? Well, they say there's some ghost in the laptop. And when the laptop stops working, they say that's when the ghost has left the laptop. So he's sort of mocking substance dualists here. So Gilbert Ryle presents an issue of substance dualism, the ghost of the machine. If our mind and body are separate, then our physical bodies must be controlled by this invisible substance. We have the risk here of falling into a problem known as solipsism. This is the idea that this ghost in the machine is somehow outside of the physical world. And in this case, how can we really know anything about the physical world if we are just like little pilots that are inside, trapped indeed, inside these little, these machines called the bodies? So Gilbert Ryle says, to talk about mind and body as two different things is a category error. Now, a category is a group that something is contained within. For a substance dualist, there are two categories: physical substance, the body, and spiritual substance, the soul. And Gilbert Ryle says that this is an error, it's a mistake. This is the example that he gives, and it's a really important example. I'm going to try and explain it to you. So Gilbert Ryle says, imagine you're walking around Oxford University, and you're being given the tour of the university. And the tour guide says, here is the library, and here are the student halls, and here are the lecture theatres, and here's the cafeteria. And the tour guide shows you every single physical building in the university. And let's imagine that at the end of the tour, you said to him, oh, thanks for showing me all the buildings, but can you show me the university now? And Ryle thinks, well, that wouldn't make sense. The university is nothing more than the physical buildings. The university isn't something separate. It just is the library, the cafeteria, the lecture halls, etc. Similarly, we could give a tour of the brain, and we could explain this part's responsible for emotion, this part's responsible for reason. The substance dualist at the end of this tour would say, okay, but where's you? Where's the soul? And Gilbert Ryle is saying that the brain is the soul. There's nothing more to the soul or the mind than the brain. It just is the collection of all the working parts of the physical brain. So he says it's a category error. There is only one category, and that's brain. There aren't two categories. In much the same way that there is only one category, Oxford University, there aren't two different things. Oxford University just is the buildings and the people and the physical university. Similarly, the brain just is the mind. There isn't a separate soul. So materialism is the view that the mind and mental experiences can be explained according to physical matter. There is nothing more to your mind than the physical workings of your brain. Thomas Hobbes agrees with this. He says, I can explain all the workings of the mind using only material resources. What need is there to postulate an immaterial mind when this perfectly good and more minimal explanation is available? So Ryle says it's a little bit like saying, show me the team spirit. Here's the team, show me the team spirit. Well, it doesn't make sense to say this, because the term team spirit isn't something observable or separate from the team. It just is the team and the way they interact. And similarly, the mind just is the brain and the way it interacts. It's not something separate. So to talk about the team spirit as though it were a separate thing is to make a category error, just as talking about the mind as though it is separate from the body is a category error. It is to talk about two things as though they are different. So substance dualism is the view that the mind and the body are two distinct substances. Dualists such as Plato and Descartes believe that the mind cannot be considered in the same category as the body. Descartes says, this is because I can doubt my body, but I cannot doubt my mind. Therefore, they must be different. One strength of this view is that it does seem difficult to see how the mind can be reduced to the physical workings of the brain. They appear so different. Descartes agrees with this, saying that the soul has properties of thought, whereas the body has properties of extension. Materialism is the view that the mind and body are both the same thing. The mind is simply the physical workings of the brain. Gilbert Ryle believes that traditional understandings of mind-body dualism are guilty of a category error. This is when we suppose that they belong to different categories, which is just as wrong as saying that Oxford University is different to the buildings that compose Oxford University. The strength of this is it's much more in line with modern scientific thinking. So Ryle is not rejecting that people have a mind. He's just saying that the mind is the body. It's the brain. Okay? Modern scientists like Richard Dawkins would agree with this. Rejects the claim that human beings have a soul. Just as with other animals, we are the vehicles of genes which want to replicate themselves in order to survive. There is nothing more than the physical, material universe. Now, Dawkins talks about two different ideas of souls. The first idea of the soul, historically, is soul one. This is sort of Plato's idea of the soul. The soul is separate from the body, and he thinks that this is wrong. The second idea of the soul is Aristotle's. The idea that the soul is just the identity of the physical body, and he agrees with this. So he agrees with Aristotle, but disagrees with Plato. Okay, so we have Richard Dawkins. We also have the philosopher Bertrand Russell. This is the idea that they agree with. There's no sound basis for ideas about an immortal soul. They're beliefs based on wish fulfillment, which means we are so desperate to think that we're special, and we're so desperate to think that we survive death, that we invent this idea of a soul. So it's for people who lack courage. They fear death and cannot cope with the idea of mortality. Instead, consciousness is just electrochemical events in the brain. The person is incapable of surviving death. So a good way of attacking or analyzing these theories is to consider William of Ockham. Now, William of Ockham is a very ancient or old thinker. So he's a scholastic. He's writing at about the time of Thomas Aquinas, around 1,000 years ago. And he comes up with an idea called Occam's razor. This is just an argument. Razor is something that can cut through arguments. He states, all things being equal, the simplest solution tends to be the best one. So which one is simpler, dualism or materialism? Just think about that to yourself. Well, many people would say that materialism is simpler. There's only one thing, the physical body, that's evolved to be able to think. So evolution shows that humans have developed from simpler species. If animals have no soul, how can we explain the fact that humans have a soul? So evolution is the idea that, look, there must be only materialism. Because if evolution is true, when did we evolve a soul? And how do you evolve a soul? Was there a monkey who didn't have a soul and then it had children that had a soul? So evolution seems to be arguments for materialism. Okay, so going back to Occam's razor, he says that the metaphysically simpler solution is generally the correct one. So this is the idea of not multiplying categories beyond necessity. So this is a little bit of a complicated idea, and we're sort of running out of time, but all it means is if you have to explain something, you've got two competing explanations. The one which has fewer categories, fewer things that need to be accounted for, is usually the correct one. So, two things or one thing? Mind and body, or body and soul, or just body? And this is going to suggest that materialism is simpler. So, evaluating dualism. Well, we don't really have time to go through this. We have done a little bit of it already. Another critic, Anthony Flew, who is a materialist, is very similar to Gilbert Ryle. He says to speak of the mind as though it's a substance is a mistake. To refer to the mind is simply to refer to the behavior of a physical person. The mind cannot survive death because after death, the physical body no longer displays any behavior. And he gives the analogy of the Cheshire Cat. And this is from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And in this story, there's a cat and he smiles and he disappears. But before he disappears, his smile remains. So his smile is still there. Now, this is obviously just a joke in Lewis Carroll's book. However, Anthony Flew says that it's a little bit like the mind and the soul. The cat's smile or grin in Lewis Carroll is spoken of as though it's a separate substance. It can leave the cat and it can survive the cat, and it's a different thing to the cat. But it's not. The smile is the same thing as the cat. The cat is the smile is the cat. Similarly, the mind isn't something separate from the body. It can't survive the body. The mind is just the way that the body manifests in the world. And Peter Smith and O.R. Jones, they suggest that the way we use language sometimes suggests that things are separate when they're not. For example, we say, for example, Jack needs to buy a bigger t-shirt for his build. Or we need to hurry up for Jill's sake. Now look, is Jack something separate from his build? No, Jack's build, his muscles, are just him. We need to hurry up for Jill's sake. Is Jill's sake something separate from Jill? No. And similarly, we might talk about the mind as though it's separate from the body, but that's just language. So we have weaknesses of substance dualism. We also have weaknesses in materialism. Language again. We don't say Emily's body went to the cinema. We say Emily went to the cinema. If I said Emily's body went to the cinema, that would sound really weird. But if we are just our bodies, then that should be quite normal. So this suggests that actually language demonstrates that there is something more to us than just our bodies. Okay, so Emily's body was found in the garden, for example. Now, this would make sense, okay? And this would make sense to language because language, in this instance, is showing that the mind has left, or the soul has left the body. So it does make sense to say Emily's body, and we don't say Emily was found in the garden when she's dead, because we don't think of the body as you. We don't say Emily was found in the garden when she's dead. So this suggests that there's something more to us than just the body. When we're living, thinking beings, we're more than just a physical body. Okay, and we could still criticize this. It could just be that we use language sloppily. So, does it support materialism or not? There are lots of other arguments. We don't really have too much time to go through them. Okay, well, we have Richard Swinburne, who says there are fundamental truths that cannot be explained in purely physical terms. So he believes in dualism. We have different ways of analyzing this. So you can pause the video and take a look at these now. According to theists, we only know how to be good because we have a soul. Therefore, without dualism, there's no reason to be good. What do you think of this? You can analyze this in your own time. Keith Ward says the same thing. Without belief in the soul, morality is pointless. Do you agree with this? You think about this in your own time. So we have weaknesses in materialism. We also have arguments for dualism, the idea of brain death. This is the idea that the body can live and the mind be dead, so they must be separate. We also have the idea that others can observe my body, but no one can observe my mind, therefore they're different. We have the idea that thoughts are about things, but the body isn't about anything, so they must be different. This is an argument from intentionality. And we have the argument from perception. Okay, I can see red, but there doesn't seem to be red as a color in my brain. My brain doesn't go red when I see red. And that suggests that there is something else going on just beyond the physical when I experience physical things. Okay? And feel free to read through this in your own time. Okay, so a lot of content covered in this lesson. Feel free to go over it and watch it a number of times. We've had to race through the last few sections a little quicker than normal because we are over the hour now. Thank you very much, Year 12, and we'll be looking at arguments for the existence of God next week.